Welcome to the Darkstream, VoxDay, voxday.net, and unauthorized.tv. So welcome to all the bears. Hope you guys had a good time at the Beartaria Festival. I'm told the audio is good, the video is good. Already got some folks up on the unauthorized chat. I'm told, volume is low, that's right. There we go. Yep, so I finally have enough voice to actually do some recording. So I was doing a little bit of that earlier today. Probably have to redo it all because I was coughing up a storm, but we'll see. So anyhow, John Bradley will be happy that I'm finally getting around to some of this stuff, so that's good. The topic is not a particularly cheery one. I think we're going to have to devote a stream to the very, very important question of Messi versus Pele versus Maradona versus Cristiano Ronaldo at some point in time, even though I pretty much covered that all on the blog. Not that Nate Silver didn't do it a long time before me, but sometimes you have to figure these things out for yourself. Anyhow, the reason I wanted to talk about World War III and give a World War III update is because I'm starting to see a lot of indications that we're pretty rapidly moving towards the next stage. Now, I understand that a lot of people just don't view this as anything massively serious. Alternatively, some people go to the opposite extreme and they're predicting nukes flying. I think we can address that possibility pretty easily too, which we'll do. But first of all, I want to point out a couple things. Number one, the mainstream narrative on Ukraine has shifted considerably. Exterminator Bear says, how long has it been in phony war status? What Exterminator Bear is referring to there is that for several years, or I should say for over a year, World War II was known as the phony war because nothing was really happening between Britain and Nazi Germany. War had been declared, but there wasn't anything too dramatic right up until the fall of France. And then, of course, things progressed rapidly from there. But what people are not considering is that the war that's taking place is the largest scale war that the world has seen in a long time. The United States has literally never fought a war of this scale, not even when it fought in World War II. You can look it up. The Eastern Front War in World War II was an order of magnitude or more bigger than the Western Front. And even though the current war between Ukraine/NATO and Russia is much smaller than the similar events in the same region 50 years ago, or whatever it was, 75 years ago, it's still on a scale that is bigger than the United States has ever fought, except for possibly the Civil War. And of course, things have changed considerably since then. Not only that, but the nature of war has changed because of the advances in technology. The Idaho Crusader said, "Do you think the U.S. will actually be able to throw down before its economy implodes?" No, I don't think so, because I think that Russia and China are waiting for that. It's very, very clear that neither Russia nor China are in any hurry. Why would they be in a hurry to engage in actual direct military conflict when they're getting when they're benefiting even more than they imagined possible in the economic war? It's really important to grasp that on a geopolitical level, the economic elements are just as important, if not more important, than the military elements. Neither Germany nor Japan ever had a chance of winning a war that was going to be fought to the end. And they knew that. All of their plans involved the same type of nonsensical, posturing diplomatic nonsensical nonsense. It all involved hoping that the enemy would quit. A lot of Hitler's strategies were based on his attitudes about the national characters. And he got it very, very wrong. The Japanese had no intention of attempting to fight it out with the USA. And remember, Japan didn't start its war in 1941. It started its war more like 1931. They'd taken over Manchuria. They were fighting in China. They were fighting the British and taking over the British colonies there. The whole thing with Pearl Harbor was just supposed to bloody the U.S. nose and warn them off and tell them to stay out of it. I mean, think about what an utter, totally miscalculation, a total utter miscalculation that was. Hitler really thought that they might be able to convince Britain to come around. I don't think he realized how completely controlled Churchill was. And it's interesting, a new book has come out that demonstrates pretty conclusively that Churchill was gay. And so there might have been some additional leverage on Churchill in that regard. I'm not a big fan of it's usually gay historians going back and declaring everybody from Alexander the Great to every Spartan and Athenian figure of any note being gay. This isn't that. I mean, I read this article in the Daily Mail. I need to put it on the blog at some point, or maybe we should discuss it here. But I mean, you're reading it going, yeah, that's questionable. Yeah, that's a little strange. Oh yeah, there's no way he was straight. So anyhow, and yes, there was no accident that the U.S. entered the war. Churchill and Roosevelt were desperate to get them involved, and now, and now the the Japanese were foolish enough to take the bait. Admiral Yamamoto, who was the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, he relentlessly advised against attacking the U.S. He knew what was likely to happen, but he had his orders. It wasn't up to him. Is there a good way to prep for World War III if you do not have a lot of time or money? You don't prep for something like a world war. What you do is you do your best to put yourself in a location that is unlikely to be significantly affected. During World War II, during World War I, there were entire parts of the world that had no idea anything was going on. It's not going to be everywhere and all over the place. I mean, it's a total nightmare in parts of Ukraine right now, and yet everywhere else, we're practically unconscious of it. We're still thinking of it as a phony war, despite the fact that the casualties are probably well over 500,000. It's terrible. And so anyhow, if you look at the developments, and if you look at the beginning, this war, first of all, did not begin in 2022. It began in 2014. It began when the duly elected government of Ukraine was violently overthrown in a neo-clown US-backed coup. This isn't up for debate. Even the head of NATO openly admitted this recently. And so, but it was a very small regional war. And then of course there were the Minsk agreements, the Minsk II agreements, the Ukrainian regime, the Zelensky regime, did not keep to the Minsk agreements. They completely violated them. They killed something like 7,000 people, 7,000 of their own citizens in the Donbass republics, the separatist republics. In Riding the Red Horse, we actually have a story. This is published, back in 2015. We actually have a story that was written by the Kurgan that we published that was all about that war. Between the Donbass separatists, the Novorussians, and the Ukrainian regime. But we had no idea that it was going to go this big. And so, NATO has now, I think it came out recently that NATO had spent let me look this up. I mean, the number actually surprised me because it was even more than I had imagined. Let's see here. It's on Russia Today. And let's see if I can find this. Ukraine is spending $100 million a day on the conflict with Russia. That's not coming out of the Ukrainian budget. There is no Ukrainian budget. They don't even have an economy at this point. It's all coming from the West. Here we go. Ukraine's Western backers have given Kiev at least $100 billion worth of weapons, including more than $50 billion from the U.S. alone, since Russia's military operation in Ukraine began last February. That's courtesy of Ukraine Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov. So there's a tremendous amount of money, weapons, resources that are getting pumped into this for nothing except to buy time. and to kill more Ukrainians. This, by the way, is one of the reasons why you never ever want to allow foreigners to become your national leader, because they don't give a damn about people who are different than them. They use them, you know. In the same way that Zelensky is perfectly happy to fight to the very last Ukrainian, someone like Rishi Sunak is going to be more than happy to fight to the last British person. Of course, the neo-clowns are more than happy to fight to the last Ukrainian or the last Israeli or whatever. They don't give a damn about anybody. You know. And so what I've been seeing in the last week, so we've had this, 3 months now of the big, much ballyhooed Ukrainian counteroffensive. It's gone nowhere. All of the Western Wunderwaffen have proven to be totally useless. And so what's the point? Chris Hawk asks, why is the West buying time? Some of them must know it's not on their side. Well, the reason that the West is buying time is because they're terrified of what's going to happen once Ukraine surrenders. Ukraine is going to have to surrender. The Russians haven't demanded unconditional surrender. But the Russians also know that the Kiev regime does not have the authority or the power to surrender. There was a peace deal in place in 2022. The Zelensky regime wanted to accept it, and the Brits told them, no, you can't, and if you don't accept it, we'll provide all the weapons you need, and we'll provide you with all this money. And they did. They came through on that. Because they genuinely believed, and I'm now convinced that they did genuinely believe, that they were going to be able to win. The Russians were not supposed to be as capable as they turned out to be. One thing that a lot of people didn't realize at the time is that the Russians were basically outnumbered by the Ukrainians at the beginning of the special military operation. That's one of the reasons why Putin sent in the paratroops and tried that decapitation move at the beginning, because they didn't think they had enough troops to attack successfully. Now they do. Now they've mobilized, first, I think they've mobilized something in the 550,000 troops. And they've also been able to slaughter something like 350,000 Ukrainian troops. So the advantage now has shifted to Russia. And it's not just, you might remember we did a Darkstream a few weeks ago where I said the smarter neoclowns are beginning to realize that there's no possibility of winning, so they need to pivot to China. Well, now we're seeing that message being percolating through the mainstream media. Right now it's still the elite institutions, New York Times, Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, but they're already changing that narrative. 3 months ago, the narrative was still Ukraine is going to win. This offensive is going to take place with all the great Western weapons and the Western trained Ukrainian troops and the mercenaries, and they're going to take Crimea, and this is going to cause the Russians to kick out Putin and agree to a peace. It was total nonsense. But that was the plan. Remember, the fact that a plan fails doesn't mean it didn't exist in the first place. And so the problem that the West has, and Hawk is right, time is not on their side, because Russia and China are winning the economic war. The German economy, which is the engine of Europe, is already in recession. The Russian economy is growing as much as more than the German economy is shrinking. And so, the economic noose is tightening. Some of us are already beginning to feel it. I've seen on Social Galactic, for the first time in a long time, I've seen 3-4 people in the last 2 weeks talking about how they'd been laid off. So the economic stranglehold is beginning to tighten a little bit. But the reason that they won't let the Ukrainians surrender is that there's a very good chance that multiple European governments will collapse and will immediately run to Russia. The Russian economy is not debt-based because they weren't allowed to go into heavy debt. Basically, the Russians have been fortunate because they've been forced to do the right thing economically by their enemies. And that's one of the reasons why they're in such good shape. But they've also been responsible too. You got to give them credit where credit is due. I mean, think about this. The U.S. had to blow up the Nord Stream pipeline to prevent the Germans from buying fuel from Russia. The minute that the Ukrainians surrender, the Germans are going to start buying from Russia. There's a very good chance that both NATO and the EU are going to collapse when Ukraine surrenders. And so that's why they need to buy time, because they know that the scenario in Europe, and remember, the US has benefited by essentially having European colonies and then African sub-colonies for the last 75 years. That's one area where the left back in the 60s and 70s was actually correct. The US did have a hegemony, and they were running the Western European governments essentially as provinces, and extricating a lot of economic benefit out of it. Now, they're in the position of potentially losing not just all the Western European satrapies that they've got, but also the Eastern European ones that they picked up over the last 20 years. Most Europeans are not crazy about what they've been seeing. They don't like the invasion of migrants that's been foisted on them by the US. They don't like the economic situation. And they've been willing to kind of put up with it. But once it becomes obvious that the US empire is collapsing, they're all going to want to get out. They're all going to want to get out of it. So that's what they're afraid of. Britain has already left the EU. Italy's already making noises. And imagine what's going to happen if BRICS starts offering deals to economically desperate European countries with the requirement of get out of NATO, get out of the EU. Can you see Hungary turning down that deal? I mean, at this point, Germany might take it. And so so that's one thing that's going on. You know, I don't know if and when Russia is going to launch its own offensive. They've certainly got the ability to do so. I don't think that they want to do so because they've tested a few things. And the reality is that with all the drones and all the long-range missiles and all that sort of thing, and to say nothing of the recon satellites and so forth, it's not going to be much easier for Russia to make a lot of headway any more than it was for Ukraine. So why bother? But it's clear that things are starting to spread. There's already news that Putin and the North Korean leader have been discussing the North Koreans supplying the Russians with missiles. China has openly been warning the Asian countries, and specifically the Philippines, to not allow themselves to get used the way that Ukraine was. But Japan just struck a deal where they are giving the U.S. permission to expand the runways at the U.S. Air Force bases in Okinawa in return for the U.S. letting them dump the irradiated water from Fukushima into the ocean, which China's very unhappy about, by the way. So we're seeing that. And then in Africa, what I thought was really interesting was after we saw Niger and I think it was Gabon start kicking the French out. The U.S. was relying upon, the U.S. took this very seriously. They actually flew Victoria Nuland, who's the architect of the coup in Ukraine. They actually flew her into Niger to try to get, tell them to back down or else. But what's interesting is that suddenly the Nigerian government is looking pretty shaky. The current leader is very much a U.S. controlled creature. And they recalled all their ambassadors, they fired a bunch of ministers and so forth. What that tells us is that Nigeria, which is supposed to be, which provides half the troops to ECOWAS and is basically supposed to be the U.S. enforcement arm in Africa to keep everybody in line. It means that the U.S. has probably already lost control of Africa if it hasn't, it's losing control of Africa if it hasn't done so already. And so this is going to put further pressure on the Europeans because, for example, France gets all of its uranium to power its nuclear reactors from Niger. They can't get it anymore, and they're not buying gas from Russia. Where are they going to get their energy? There's not enough windmills to run all the electric cars. And so, and like some of you guys have said, we're already starting to see unrest. And in Ireland, people are getting more and more upset with the migrants. Israel's threatening to kick all the Eritreans out. The Eritreans were even causing some minor trouble in Switzerland, of all places. Two groups of them were fighting about what's happening with the politics in Eritrea. And so, these are all indications that the the existing global war is going to heat up a little bit. And, um, no, Ladumba says maybe that will make diversity move back. They're not going to move back until they're deported. It doesn't matter how bad it is in Europe or in the United States. It's still better than what they have back in Africa because nobody's supporting them. You know, very, very few of the migrants, whether they're from Turkey, whether they're from Africa, wherever, you know, they're all being supported by the state. Maybe it's coming through a charity organization that is funded by the state, but it's, none of them are supporting themselves. And so, no, you can't wish. These are not times for wishful thinking. These are times for very cold, rationalistic, analytical thinking. Sitting around and wishing things were different is the way the boomers handle things. Doesn't work. It doesn't behoove any of you here. You guys are all smarter than that. And we've enjoyed one of the longest runs of peace that has ever been known in human history. That time has come to an end. But what that means is that we are some of the weakest people in human history. Because unfortunately, peace and good times leads to basically being fat, soft, and hedonistic. And all you have to do is go out to the mall, go out to the store, whatever, and you can see with the evidence of your own eyes how true that is. Idaho Crusader said, at this rate, it seems more likely that the U.S. is going to be fighting on its own continent with its own people. That does look increasingly likely. The U.S. is already in full banana republic mode. The only reason that there isn't more resistance is because the oppression is pretty soft. Most of the quote-unquote resistance is fake. Those neo-Nazis demonstrating in Georgia or Florida, whatever, that's the ADL. They're still trying to manage the situation through the public narrative. But like we saw with Kyle Rittenhouse, like we saw with what's happening in Maui, like we saw with these recent deadly FBI raids, things are starting to get they're starting to cross that dangerous line into violence. And nobody's going to do anything as long as they feel like they're going to be okay and that they're going to be left alone. It's just like in Iraq. One of the things that the Donald Rumsfeld and the military strategists were very, very conscious of was they needed to be careful not to create more terrorists, as they called them, than they killed. And of course, we all know that they completely failed because, when you bomb a wedding party, maybe you kill 10 terrorists, but you kill a lot more innocent people and create 100 more. So far, nobody cares that some boomer shooting his mouth off on Facebook was killed by the government. So far, the kinds of people who have been murdered by immigrants are the kind of people who are more concerned about being seen to publicly forgive their child's killer than in seeking vengeance. And so, that I think is why we haven't seen anything happen. But it also tends to indicate that they don't want that to happen. Which leads me to what I was talking before about how people are saying, oh, well, the US will launch nukes rather than give up Europe. I don't believe that's true. I mean, if there's one thing we know about the USA, is that it doesn't like fair fights. It doesn't like to get punched in the face. It has no desire for that. Yep, just reload. Just reload. Apparently we had the dropped a few frames there. So, but if you look at the fact that the U.S. doesn't even want to get directly involved in Ukraine, they've gone out of their way to create plausible deniability, even though we know perfectly well that a number of generals and a number of colonels have been killed over there. We know it, the Russians know it, the Chinese know it, but it's all being done in a sufficiently deniable way that it's not necessary to. There's no political pressure on Putin to strike back directly against the USA. Exterminator Bear says, U.S. generals. Yes, Exterminator Bear. Have a look at how many U.S. generals have died in the last 6 months in automobile crashes. They don't report them as being killed over in Ukraine, but, most of them have been. It's not like the roads suddenly got dangerous in the last year. Hawk points out exactly what I was talking about. Forget what the U.S. wants to do. They do not want to get themselves nuked over Europe, Africa, and Asia. Precisely. There's no way that the U.S. is going to engage in any sort of nuclear exchange with Russia. They won't do it. They won't even send their F-16s over there because they don't want them shot down over there. So, I think that if you look at the people who talk about how, they're bad losers, and so they'll just nuke everything. Well, that's not true. They didn't do that with Vietnam. They just went home with their tail tucked between their legs. They didn't do that with Iraq. They didn't do that with Afghanistan. Why would they do it over Europe? The U.S. should have withdrawn from Europe 30 years ago, maybe more. It absolutely should have withdrawn from Europe in 1990. So the idea that they're going to destroy all the major cities in the USA because they're so upset that they can't tell the Germans what to do anymore. I mean, that doesn't even make any sense. That's as a general rule, whenever you hear public figures or military analysts talking in personal or emotional terms, when they start making predictions based on the motivations of a small number of people, that's almost always guaranteed to be wrong. Look at all the people that are trying to predict what's going to happen in Ukraine on the basis of what Putin wants, what his personality is, how popular he is in Russia. The fact is that in large countries, they don't do regime change the way they do in banana republics. I mean, frankly, I think Biden is much more likely to be overthrown without any election taking place than Putin. Will the U.S. stay involved till its loss can't be denied? It's hard to say. It's hard to say because the smarter neoclowns are already telling the U.S. to get the hell out. They understand that China is the much bigger threat. The only thing that Russia can do is engage in a mutually destructive exchange of nuclear missiles. Right? And the Russians have made it very clear, we're not going to do that unless there's an existential threat to Russia. A battle over Europe is not an existential threat to Russia. And it's not a threat to the U.S. at all. But China is a serious threat to completely remove the U.S. as a major global power. Don't forget, the U.S. hasn't always been a major global power. It didn't really become one until after World War II. The U.S. was not in any position to take on the British until after World War II. And the Chinese Navy is going to be in a position not only to contest the seas with the USA, but it's probably already in a position, with Russia's help, to completely drive the U.S. off the oceans. They couldn't do it all at once, but when you've got 200 times the shipbuilding capacity of your enemy, the outcome is inevitable. That's why I've said, I don't think that there's going to be a shot being fired over Taiwan. People were astonished just yesterday because China announced a new satellite phone. It has 5G technology that they weren't supposed to be able to do. They weren't supposed to be able to do it because first the Trump administration, then the Biden administration denied them the chips that were required to do that kind of 5G technology, China built it themselves. They not only built the chips, they've already successfully implemented them in consumer products. This was not supposed to happen, not yet. People say, well, they just reverse engineered and stole blah blah blah. That doesn't matter. The point is that the US's ability to keep China in a technological box is over. What do you think about the Taiwanese billionaire that is running for president next year? Is he close to Xi? I have no idea because I haven't looked into him at this point, but I strongly suspect, given what China isn't saying about him and the fact that the Western media seems to be kind of confused by him, that he is possibly an ally of Xi, who is going to be the one to bring Taiwan into peaceful reunification with the mainland. It's going to be very, very interesting to see who he's connected to. I don't think that what's it called, the DPP? I don't think that, he's obviously not, he's in the technology sector. He's not, if he's running for president, then he's obviously not part of the independent/separatist party, which is currently controls the presidency. And, I've been expecting, I've said this numerous times, I've been expecting that that China is going to make its move on Taiwan relatively soon, but I think it's going to be a peaceful move. And getting a friendly leader elected would be one of the smartest things that they could do. Because all the Taiwanese need is to have a government, have a president who is willing to sign a deal with the mainland Chinese government, or with the Chinese government. And that's how the Nazis took over most of the European countries so easily. They barely had to fight countries like Belgium, Holland. They essentially sent a company of troops to the capital, and the government immediately surrendered and ordered the entire armed forces to lay down their arms, and it was over. That was one of the reasons why the commanding general in Switzerland, General Guizon, issued a statement making it clear that there was no one authority, there's no one individual or political position that had the authority to provide Switzerland's surrender. Ladumba says, if anyone is interested, his name is Terry Gou, G-O-U, and he's the founder of Foxconn. Foxconn is one of the biggest Chinese technology companies. I think they make, among other things, they make all the iPhones. And he's running as an independent. Yeah, well, that's also particularly interesting that he's running as an independent, because the existing parties have their platforms and they have their official positions on reunification. If he's running as an independent, he's not going to be tied down by any of the historical commitments made by those parties. I don't know. Other than the fact that this billionaire had announced he was running for president, I've been a little busy. I hadn't had time to dig into that one. But my instincts tell me that the uh, he is going to be supported by the Chinese government, and that he is probably the individual who has been selected to bring Taiwan into peaceful reunification, which I think would be fantastic. You know, um, the last thing that anyone should want to see is Taiwan signed up to play Ukraine. There's no possible way, even if the U.S. got directly involved, that they could do anything about a forcible reunification. And the Chinese don't want that either. The Hawk says, "Wonder how many business dealings Xi had with him in his time as provincial leader." Yeah, I suspect that Xi knows this guy very, very well. Something that I've been pointing out again and again is that when he was coming up through the CPC, Xi was first the governor of the one province that borders Taiwan. It's across the sea from Taiwan. And then he got promoted to being the governor of the other province. And he spent most of his time as provincial governor working with Taiwanese businessmen, bringing investment into the mainland. Apparently, Gu said during his announcement that it's the era of entrepreneurs rule. Yeah, I think he's not going to talk very much, if at all, about the reunification issue. If my suspicions are correct, he's going to talk a lot about economics, about working together with the mainland to mutual benefit. If you read much Chinese diplomacy, and I literally read their foreign ministries' press interviews and press releases every day. I find them much more informative than the average newspaper. I mean, yes, they're speaking for China. That's literally their job, but at least you know what China's actually saying, right? But they have a certain language that they use, and it's always relentlessly positive, win-win. They love to talk about the close and eternal bonds between the Chinese people and the Indonesian people, or the Pakistani people, etc., etc. I mean, their diplomats are really good. I mean, it's funny because they, just like with the U.S. press corps, they get thrown curveballs and loaded questions and stuff, and it's just funny. I mean, I think that I could probably do a credible job now. I'd have to do it in writing. I couldn't do it just live, but I think I could do a credible job of sounding like a Chinese foreign ministry diplomat. If I had to answer questions of the sort that they get. I mean, it's kind of hilarious the way that they'll just avoid condemning the Russians no matter what. And it's also funny how they'll always sound very friendly, kind of a concerned big brother about like an earthquake in Turkey. They really like to express solidarity and talk about multipolarity and win-win scenarios and all that sort of thing. When you when you compare it and contrast it to that not very bright black spokeswoman for President Biden, it's pretty funny. But I have to admit, I just enjoy seeing competence, and they're so much better than either the Russian diplomats or the U.S. diplomats. It's not even funny, because the U.S. diplomats are always threatening people, and always, talking about how awful and evil everybody is, and it's anyhow. Maybe it amuses only me, but I do find it interesting. But the point is that this is the time to look for opportunities that are on the safer side, that are on the. This is not the time that you want to expand and borrow and do all that sort of thing. This is the time to dig in, get your hands dirty, and build. Ideally in a safe place. So those of you who've been listening to Owen for the last 5 years are probably going to be in a better place than a lot of people. Your indoor plumbing argument may be the most rhetorically effective for normies. Could you reiterate it, please? Well, generally, I'd just say, look, you can't continue going down this road, because it's not about whether you like Trump. It's not about whether you like the idea of deportations. It's about whether you like having indoor plumbing. If things continue on the path that they are on, you're not just going to lose your satellite TV. You're not just going to lose your mobile phone. You're going to lose the ability to flush your damn toilet. So it's not like a specific rhetorical phrase like magic dirt. It's more of a response when you're trying to explain to someone the reality of the situation, and they're saying, well, no, I don't think it's worth it. Because there's always a normalcy bias. Even the most hardcore conspiracy theorists have a normalcy bias, and it's very, very difficult for most people to imagine anything but a direct linear progression from where things are today. And so, and I'm not saying, the world is ending, etc., etc. It's not ending. But the world that we knew is changing. This is not the time to, go take cruises and travel the world, and that world is rapidly coming to a close. So make use of the time that you have. Make good use of it. Focus your resources on what's important. One of the reasons why we've always maintained a $5 subscription fee to this, to unauthorized, is because we want to make sure that if there's one thing that you can afford, it's being a part of this community. That's why Social Galactic access is included with it. So that and we're adding stuff. For example, we're adding the skills channel, so that when YouTube goes down, people have a place to come and watch stuff that's happening here. And also, just so you know, I mean, we're preparing for this stuff too, even on our level. Just today, our new European servers were getting installed. They're not up and running yet, but I don't know. Within, I would say that by October, we will have a complete mirrored system so that unauthorized will be running live actively on both the U.S. continent and here in Europe. So if one goes down, you should still be able to get full service. I don't know what the present numbers are. I haven't looked. I think we're probably around 7,000. You know, I'd like to get that up. I mean, ultimately, we'd like to see unauthorized get to around 20,000 subscribers. But you know, we're you know, we'll see. Bargain Bear says, my parents are planning a tour of Greece next year. Seems like a waste of 9,000. It probably is. You know, but that's your parents. That's not your problem. So maybe UATV survives and YouTube is no more. I'll make a prediction right now. I will predict that when YouTube either goes under or is bought, that UATV will still be going strong and will probably have more subscribers than it does today. So, anyhow, you know, and we're doing this if the internet survives. Well, the internet is designed to survive a lot of stuff, so the chances are pretty good that the internet will survive in some form, even if it's all via, you know, a balloon version of Starlink or something. Be Good says, wish we could get Wrangler Star to focus more on UATV. Nobody's going to focus on UATV until they have to. You know, you know, we're still just pumping along, bumping along, and you know, until the next exterior crisis. You know, I don't know whether it's going to be something like you know, Rumble going down or you know, or what, but we know from the environment, and we know from the fact that interest rates are rising, and we know from the fact that these businesses are not profitable and that they're propped up, they're not going to survive. And you know, we're set up to operate on, you know, very, very little. You know, and give credit to Owen in particular for being committed to just keeping the thing rolling, no matter what. And you know, I don't blame any of these folks who want to make hay while the sun is shining. You know, I actively encourage them to. Although it would be good if they would, you know, push the subscriber base a little more. But, you know, it'll get there. The important thing is for us to be prepared. Idaho Crusader says, I just have a hard time believing that anything complex is going to survive in the U.S. after its collapse. The U.S. is a political entity that spans an entire continent. There's going to be a lot of things that will operate just fine when the U.S. collapses. You know, money is just a way of keeping track. What's what's going to happen, when the money stops flowing in the U.S.? It's still going to flow elsewhere around the world. People are still going to figure out ways to, buy milk, buy food, etc., etc. So not everything is going to fall apart completely. The U.S. collapsing does not mean every single structure in the U.S. falling down and every single, technological implement failing. The U.S. is way, way ahead of, places like Africa, and they still have power and they still have water and so forth. They still have internet. So, anyhow, be smart, be wise, use the time that we have left to prepare well, and focus your resources on the things that are A, important, and B, that are going to last. That's why everything that we're doing right now, we're not doing anything fancy. Everything we're doing right now is either stuff we've committed to, to providing, the comic stuff, infrastructure, and books that will last for hundreds of years. You're going to be fine. And we're going to be fine. So, so the important thing is we just keep calm and we keep working on this together. If you've got a subscription to WWIII and you're not on Social Galactic yet, get on Social Galactic. There's a reason it's there. Okay? We have a super chat from Pug Fugly Bear. Thank you, Pug Fugly Bear. Is Russia's collapse in the 90s a good predictor of what we will experience? I don't think so, because I don't think the U.S. is already run by the neoclowns and is already being financially parasitized by them. So, that element of the collapse, which was the oligarchs coming in and privatizing and taking everything over. So I don't think that is a very good predictor. So on that note, I will let you all go. Have a good evening. I will see you at the next Darkstream. I'm Vox Day, and this is the Darkstream.